But there's a reason for her sort of absorption into the recesses of the, past the borders of the canvas.
Well, I think the idea of the single figure and a figure being alone, the importance of the relationship or possible relationships that the figure could be having with not only its surrounding, which you saw in the first painting, but also with the other figure, becomes a very important question, because the idea of aloneness and of solitude is a whole different question if you contrast it to a relationship. And so I think I started in a few paintings working with two figures and seeing how that has an influence not only on the idea of solitude of the single figure, but then also on the...
But if you're interested in solitude, why put another person in it?
Well, because I still believe that that's the question and the problem of solitude is not necessarily solved
by being alone.
Yeah, by being alone or by being together. Right. So it still remains. Right. There's still a big question. I experienced that with my relationships, that there is that point where a relationship, interpersonal relationship, actually substitutes for certain things, but still there's a strong sense of being alone, and this is on different levels. This can go from being misunderstood, sure, being just not on the same wavelength, and so I think being alone and the idea of being detached from the environment, including people, is something
even when
we
you're
still
with people,
feel within society and within community.
So it's interesting because you paint figuratively, and yet you're sort of preoccupied with a lot of spatial issues, and which would seem more suited to abstraction, simply because you would be removing the subjectivity of figuration, so that you can focus on the games that a lot of abstractionists play with space and line and form, etc. But that you do that as a sort of representational artist is very interesting.
Well, I find it extremely difficult to work abstractively or in an abstract form for the sake of abstraction. And I think also abstract art has a tradition of emerging from the figurative. So for me, that's true in my work, that installations and painting always have some figurative aspect to it, because I use it as a form of actually playing and exploring abstraction. So it becomes easier doing it over a figure than for the sake of just aligning two abstract colors that are abstract in their nature to another. It's interesting for me to use a figure which is not, doesn't have any abstract connotations to begin with, and try to integrate that in an idea of abstraction.
There's an unfinished quality too to these that for instance, in the previous painting, we saw him up to about his waistline, and then he disappears.
Well, I think part of the unfinishedness of the painting comes from my interest of carrying the painting on after the painting process. So the idea of a finished artwork, quote unquote, is something that I don't struggle with it, but it's something that I use carefully, because my idea of using, or my interest of actually carrying the painting into the space and working in this form of taking it off the stretcher, which is a vulnerable thing to do for a painting, because you're taking it off the form that it's actually meant to be on. It has a long tradition in that form. And so as a painting in classical sense, it's unfinished from the beginning, because I'm not priming it, and also it goes to the end presentation form that is, again, actually I'm using a stage in the process of painting that is unfinished in itself. It's the unstretched canvas before it might be before it's stretched back on to actually be presented in its full beauty or in its full form. And so the unfinished, this idea of being unfinished, I think is something that is not only present in the figures or in the narratives of the painting, but in my work form and
in the actual construction.
Yeah, in the actual construction as well.
You mentioned that you do quite a bit of installation work as well. Is your work equally divided between installations and painting? Do you also make sculpture, or?
Well, I don't really make sculpture. The installations are very often temporary, so they'll be up for a number of days, and the reason for that is very often that I'm using, the materials I use are paintings that have been used and will be used in different forms again.
Oh.
So
you recycle them as installation projects?
Yeah.
Sort of.
I wouldn't call it recycling.
Okay.
It's the better term probably is like
multi-usage though.
Yeah, it's multi-usage, but it's also the interest in the potential of the object of painting. So not only using it as a finished art form, but also as a building block, as a sort of material to work with. In painting, in figurative painting, obviously the portrait is very important for recognizing the figure and giving identity to the person. And here I'm using the form of the head, and it's repeated in an almost organic, abstract form, again, around his head, but then even into the body. So you have kind of this repetitiveness of the head.
Yeah, he's sort of subsumed by these circular forms that are sort of enveloping him, that he's actually becoming.
Yeah.
He's circular himself, round.
Yeah.
And why? I mean, is it sort of a meditation on our own consumption, or?
Oh, well, again, I mean, I'm very interested in how figures work and how they kind of interact and how they kind of contrast to their background. And in this case, I mean, it's basically the figure, or the elements of the figure, really just the head and his right hand. The left hand is almost as melting away.
It's decayed.
It makes the left hand makes sense as a hand because it's attached to the right hand, but without that, the whole thing would just kind of fall apart. And similar to the head.
Right. You see that his right arm and hand and his head are the last two things that belong to him.
And I think that, I mean, what I find interesting is how the idea of the figure actually only is held up by the abstract forms and not so much the representational forms, because his hand and his head could be anywhere. They're so detached from each other, but the idea of the figure comes in actually through these very non-figurative abstract forms. And so I like the idea that we're constantly, as viewers, I think we go through similar stages of solitude. And so I think we have a very strong affinity and reaction to other figures. And I think that is true in painting as well, that we're constantly looking for a personal element. We're looking for a figure, even in abstract paintings. And so I think this is a good example where we have the majority of the painting is abstract. It's non-personal. It's circular forms, but we're so strongly in search and maybe in need of the opposite, of someone we can kind of interact with. And
well, you know, this calls to mind that essay by Benjamin.
Walter Benjamin?
Yeah. About making art in the age of mechanical reproduction. Yeah. And a sense of alienation that, well, you certainly use structures, but architecture calls to mind cities, and this idea, this is a very expressionist sort of thing that you do. You know, this sort of man versus environment. And the solitude and alienation that are usually associated with people who live in very densely concentrated urban areas. You know, where despite 10 million people in this city, we can feel very alone.
Yeah.
You know? And even in our interpersonal relationships with the others, I mean, we can feel alone even in their presence.
Yeah. It's true, yeah.
Is it something you continue to explore?
Definitely. I think it's something that interests me outside of my artistic process, outside of my creative work. And so I think, the work is just a way of filtering some of those ideas and thoughts and questions I have about that.
Well, I like your introspectiveness, and I've enjoyed meeting you. Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.
I'm Theodore Bouloukos in New York with Daniel Domig, and we're here at Thrust Projects. The work will be up through the 4th of November, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks again.